cowboy forced his son to choose a bride. He picked the orphan stable girl. Before we begin, take a moment to comment your city. Where are you listening from tonight? And when the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Now find yourself a quiet place. Breathe deep and let the whispers of the Wild West carry you into this tale. Outside the window, Christmas snow drifted silently down each white flake, soft as if trying to cover the frozen prairie. Inside the grand hall of the Double B Ranch, candlelight flickered against the dark wooden walls. Laughter mingled with fiddle music, and the scent of roasted goose hung thick in the festive air. Marcus Brennan raised his glass high ready to announce a marriage that would bind the Brennan name to 5 of the most powerful families in Wyoming. But in the swell of cheers and eager glances, his son Thomas stood still. His eyes wandered to the far shadowed corner. There, in a plain gray dress, Clara balanced a tray of wine, her hands trembling just so. Tonight, before the weight of legacy and the call of his heart, Thomas Brennan would have to choose. The dawn wind swept across the wide Wyoming fields, carrying the bite of winter close at hand. Out on the endless grasslands of the Double B, cattle dotted the yellowing plain like moving stones against a faded sea. Frost clung to the fence rails, glimmering beneath the pale morning sun. Thomas stood alone by the fence, his calloused hands gripping the frozen timber. His gaze stretched far, where sky and earth met in one unbroken line. Behind him rose the Double B itself, a fortress of wood and stone, its great house sprawling stables, and the kitchen chimney breathing a faint gray smoke. It was an empire carved by his father's hand, now pressing heavy upon his own shoulders. Inside the office, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of tanned leather. Maps, contracts, and papers stamped with the red seals of Cheyenne's officials crowded the dark oak desk. Marcus Brennan, hair streaked with gray eyes, hard as mountain rock, laid a letter before his son. Thomas, his voice was low-edged like steel. The time for handshakes is over. To keep the Double B, we need alliances. 5 families, 5 daughters. You will choose one, and you will marry her before this Christmas. In the firelight, Thomas's face was still as carved stone. Only his fingers tightened around the chair until the knuckles whitened. Beyond the window, the wind howled through distant ridges, a reminder of the West's unforgiving law. There was no place here for weakness. Yet within Thomas's chest, his heart beat fast, not for those names of power, but for another glance, quiet tender by the stables. A glance his father had forbidden even to speak of. Christmas was drawing near, and the burden of an empire pressed down upon a heart that longed for freedom. Part 1. The Ultimatum. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, its red glow flickering across the walls thick with maps. Marcus Brennan's study felt less like a room and more like a silent battlefield, cigar smoke curling in the air. The scent of leather and old paper, heavy as unseen chains. Mounted heads of elk and buffalo watched from above, mute witnesses to power earned through sweat and blood. Marcus sat behind the massive oak desk, his calloused hand resting on a letter sealed in red wax. His fingers tapped against the wood, each strike slow, and waited. His gray eyes, cold as steel that never rusts, fixed on the man before him. "Sit down, Thomas." The command left no room for choice. Thomas drew in a slow breath. The sharp smoke stung his nose, urging a cough, but he kept silent. pulled out a chair and sat across from his father. Broad-shouldered as he was at that moment, he felt like a boy called before an invisible court. Marcus lifted the letter. His voice was rough, but clear, each word landing with deliberate weight. This is from the court in Cheyenne. The railroad is coming to Wyoming. The West is about to change. Those without alliances will be swallowed whole. He paused, letting the silence press down before his gaze cut sharp as a blade into his son. You're 28, old enough to be a husband, a father, and above all, the keeper of the double B. In 1 week, 5 families will bring their daughters here. You will choose one, and you will marry her before Christmas. Thomas's heart thundered like hooves galloping in his chest. Yet his shoulders did not tremble. His eyes only fell to the polished wooden floor, its strong grain like the fate that seemed to pin him to that chair. "And if I refuse?" he asked quietly, though his voice held firm. Marcus leaned back, cigar smoke curling like the breath of an old beast in the shadows. "Then you leave this place, with nothing but what you can fit in a saddlebag. No name, no money, no claim. The double B will no longer be yours." The words struck like a whip across his back. Thomas clenched his fists under the desk knuckles, pressing white against his palms. The room was so still, only the ticking clock could be heard heavy as the countdown of a sentence. Marcus leaned forward, firelight catching in his sharp eyes. "Don't think I don't know where your gaze lingers, Thomas. That girl in the stables, Clara." Thomas's chest tightened. He lifted his eyes to meet his father's, but Marcus's voice pressed on each word, dropping like a stone. "What is she but calloused hands and a ragged dress? The bank doesn't take love as collateral. Don't drag the Brennan name into the mud." Thomas swallowed hard, his voice rough, near breaking. "Clara is more than that. Enough." Marcus's fist struck the desk, the sound echoing through the wooden room. Flames leapt in the hearth, casting his stern face in fierce relief. "You have 1 week and a lifetime to bear the double B. Decide." Thomas rose, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the floor, swaying in the fire's glow. In his chest, the weight coiled tight like a steel band. He turned boots, striking heavy on the boards, the sound like a funeral drum for freedom fading away. But when his hand touched the cold iron of the door handle, it wasn't the faces of 5 glittering young ladies that filled his mind. It was the sound of a soft laugh in the hay-scented air, the gentle breath of a horse, and Clara. The door closed behind him. A draft from the hallway swept in, carrying the bite of winter snow. And inside Thomas's heart, his father's words still lashed like a whip. 1 week, 1 lifetime. Part 2. A Divided Heart. Evening settled in, and the last light of day slipped through the cracks of the barn walls, painting faint golden streaks across the straw-covered floor. Horses snorted, tails swished lazily in the air, blending with the smell of hay and worn leather. Here, the world felt gentler than in that suffocating study, thick with cigar smoke and Marcus Brennan's unyielding stare. Thomas stepped inside his boots, thudding quietly on the wooden boards. His father's words still echoed like blades in his chest. That girl in the stables. Each syllable struck again with painful clarity. At the far end, beside a restless young colt, Clara stood. Her brown hair was tied back at the nape, a few loose strands clinging to her flushed cheek. Her calico dress was patched and worn, yet she held herself steady, her hands moving tenderly over the animal's trembling hide. Her voice hummed an old tune soft as the wind drifting over the plains. Thomas stopped watching in silence. His chest tightened, part ache, part warmth. Every time he saw Clara, the world seemed to pause, his heartbeat louder than the pounding hooves outside. She looked up, her deep brown eyes catching his. For a moment, the barn itself seemed to shrink until only the two of them remained. Thomas tried to keep his voice even. "Miss Clara." A faint smile touched her lips as she lowered her head. "Mr. Thomas." Her tone was quiet, but warm like firelight on a winter's night. The colt nudged her shoulder, and Clara soothed it with a gentle stroke, her hand dusted with straw. Thomas stepped closer, the mingled scent of hay and cheap soap rising from her dress, carrying a peace no grand hall could ever give him. "My father. He called me this morning." Thomas began, his eyes fixed on her gentle face. Clara nodded, a shadow passing in her gaze. "Word travels fast. They say 5 families are coming, 5 young ladies, and 1 choice." Thomas stayed silent. He longed to tell her that gold and power meant nothing but the words caught in his throat. Clara set the brush aside and turned to face him fully. Her voice was soft, yet firm. "You shouldn't be here, Thomas. Not now. People will talk." "Let them," he answered quickly, his eyes bright with sudden fire, but the flame dimmed at her steady look. She shook her head, her brown eyes carrying a quiet strength. "You can say that because you're a Brennan. But me, I'm just an orphan who cleans the stalls. We belong to different worlds." Her words cut like a tender blade, painful yet true. Thomas longed to protest, to close the space between them, but Clara turned away. Her figure melted into the slanting light of dusk, leaving an emptiness wider than the prairie itself. "Clara," his voice cracked as he called after her. "I haven't chosen anyone yet." She paused at the doorway, her silhouette framed by the glowing light of evening. Her reply drifted back, fragile as wind, but resolute. "You will have to choose, because the double B needs you, not me." The barn door closed behind her. Inside, only Thomas remained, and the heavy sound of a horse's breath, loud as a divided heart. In his chest, a small flame flickered to life, fragile but still burning, a slender thread of hope against the weight of an empire. Part 3. The arrival of the 5 heiresses. The road leading into the Double B lay under a thin veil of dust, the winter afternoon glowing with a dull bronze light. Most days it bore only the marks of wagon wheels and horse hooves hauling hay. But today, the dust rose from the polished wheels of carriages so fine they caught what little sunlight the sky still offered. The first carriage rolled to a stop before the wide wooden porch. A servant rushed forward, lowering the small steps. From within, Eleanor Harrison descended. Her satin gown of deep blue brushed across the snow, her gloved hands delicate as birds' wings. Beside her stood her father, Mr. Harrison, carrying the confidence of a man long accustomed to power in the railroads. His eyes swept the land as if the prairie itself already belonged on his maps. Soon after, the whinny of horses rang out as the Prescott carriage arrived, black lacquer shining silver trim gleaming. Abigail Prescott stepped down, lips red as Plum Blossom's eyes alight with sharp intelligence. A hardback book rested in her hand, as if even in this moment of introduction, she intended to show her difference. Her father clasped Marcus Brennan's hand firmly, the shake heavy with unspoken bargains. The third to arrive was the Whitman coach. Its wheels crunched across frozen ruts, leaving clear imprints in the earth. Mary Whitman emerged, her style less adorned, her manner calm. Her voice steady as an underground stream, carried quiet certainty as she greeted Marcus. Meanwhile, her father whispered of water rights, a promise sharp as a blade sunk deep into the thirsty soil of the West. Then came the Carmichael carriage, its presence perfumed with exotic scents from the East. Sarah Carmichael stepped down with a refined smile, her gestures elegant as if Washington itself were watching. She greeted Marcus in a measured tone, every word carefully placed, each syllable a needle to test his response. Last came the Sterling family's arrival. Their wheels rolled across the yard as Lydia Sterling appeared, the youngest of them all. She tossed her golden hair into the wind so brightly it seemed even the snow drifted aside. Her smile was wide and unguarded, full of sunshine, as though life had never once told her no. Her father, the wealthiest merchant in the region, gripped Marcus's hand tightly, like hammering a stake into the foundation of an empire. By the time all 5 families had gathered, the porch of the Double B glowed with oil lamps, bustling with handshakes, laughter, and gowns shimmering like jewels. Yet amid the splendor, Thomas stood still. He nodded politely, shook hands, returned smiles. But his heart remained distant, for the image he longed for was not lace or diamonds, but brown hair bent under the lantern glow of the stables. And in that moment, the distance between 2 worlds, one lined with gold, the other with hay, spread wider than ever before. Part 4. The Glance at the Banquet. That night, the great hall of the Double B shone like a prairie palace. Oil lamps hung high, their golden light flickering against wooden beams, dancing over red ribbons and garlands of pine. Long tables draped in white linen gleamed with crystal glasses of wine. The scent of roast goose fresh bread and mountain pine filled the air. Violins sang above the laughter, and never had the Double B felt so foreign to the man who was meant to inherit it. Thomas sat at the place of honor, his father beside him, the 5 powerful families arrayed before them. Every word, every laugh, every glance carried the weight of hidden bargains wrapped in polite smiles. Eleanor Harrison, her dark blue gown glittering in the light, spoke with a lilting smile, as though talk of the railroad was music. The tracks will stretch as far as the Rockies. Mr. Brennan, she said, her eyes sparkling, and the Harrison name will be at the heart of it. Thomas inclined his head politely. Yes, Miss Eleanor, the railroad will change the West. Yet in his chest, it felt like a train barreling straight into him, leaving him breathless. Beside her, Abigail Prescott leaned back slightly, fingers resting on a small leather-bound book. She recited a few lines of Longfellow, her voice trailing like smoke. Have you ever read him? Mr. Brennan Thomas forced a faint smile. He wanted to confess that his life smelled of horses and prairie dust, not books. Instead, courtesy guided his tongue. I've heard of him, though not well. Perhaps someday you'll teach me. Under the chandelier's glow, Thomas felt like an unwilling actor cast as the perfect heir. But beneath the mask, his chest tightened as though trapped in a saddle too small. Mary Whitman spoke softly of water rights, her eyes brightening as she described the channels and streams. Water is life, Mr. Brennan. To control it is to control the future. Thomas stared down into his glass, the red wine swirling like a tide. A future being chosen for him, not lived by him. Sarah Carmichael raised her glass, her smile sharp as a blade. Politics, you see, is a game of patience. The winner is the one who can remain silent the longest. Thomas gave only a nod, for he knew he did not belong to that world. Then came Lydia Sterling, golden hair, gleaming as she laughed like silver bells. Wyoming is dreadfully dull. But if I were Mrs. Brennan, I'd make this place the center of every grand party. Her laughter rang across the table, but Thomas's thoughts had already drifted far to the stables, to the smell of hay, to the memory of simple peace. His eyes, though he tried to restrain them, slipped toward the far corner of the hall. There, among the shadows of bustling servants, Clara moved quietly with a tray in her hands. Her faded gray dress drew no attention in the glittering light, yet to Thomas it shone brighter than any jewel. Her brown hair was tied back a few strands, brushing her flushed cheek beads of sweat glistening under candlelight. But it was her small smile offered gently to an older guest that warmed him more than any practiced charm from the table of heiresses. Thomas swallowed hard, his father's booming laughter filling the air glasses chiming like silver bells. Yet his heart beat only to the rhythm of Clara's steps. Marcus leaned toward him, a heavy hand on his shoulder, voice cutting through the music. Smile, Thomas. Speak more. They don't just want to see you, they want to hear you. Thomas forced a reply. To Lydia nodded again at Eleanor's tale. But once Marcus turned his gaze elsewhere, Thomas's eyes strayed back, always back, like a compass fixed on one point alone. And then it happened. Clara looked up. Her brown eyes met his. Just for a heartbeat, the hall grew silent. Music, laughter, all of it fell away. Her gaze wavered, then dropped quickly as she turned aside, returning to her work. But Thomas's chest lurched wild as an untamed colt. He lifted his glass, but the bitter wine could not drown the sweetness and sorrow her glance had left behind. The banquet carried on with toasts and song, but Thomas felt adrift between two shores. One shore gleamed with light's ambition alliances his father had dreamed of. The other lived in the quiet shadow of a girl's hands, working tirelessly, eyes that stole all sound with a single glance. As the hall erupted in applause at Marcus's toast to the future of the Double B, Thomas's gaze slipped once more to the edge of the room. Clara knelt to retrieve a dropped napkin, her hand trembling slightly. His chest ached. Was this to be his truth? His love bent low in the shadows, while the world raised their glasses high. The violins shifted to a gentle waltz. Dresses swirled, eyes glistened with expectation. Marcus gave a subtle nod, his meaning clear. Invite them to dance. Thomas stood, his smile thin. He offered his hand to Eleanor, then to Lydia. He moved across the floor, each step, measured each turn precise, though his spirit remained absent. Perfumed air silken, rustled the rhythm of boots on polished wood. It was all correct, yet hollow. And in one turn, his eyes found Clara again. She stood at the hall's edge tray, in hand gaze, fixed on the floor, as though avoiding him. But she faltered just for a second. For even as he spun with Eleanor, his eyes were locked upon her. A single glance, sweet, forbidden, and painful. Clara turned quickly, her cheeks touched with red, retreating into the shadows near the door. Thomas's heart clenched. He felt as though he were betraying both worlds, the women in his arms and Clara, whose burden grew heavier with each of his stolen looks. The night wore on past midnight, voices, loud glasses, endless. Yet to Thomas, it was the longest night of his life. When Marcus rose for a final toast, pride blazing in his eyes, the hall thundered with cheers. Only Thomas's heart sank heavier, weighted like stone. One last time, he searched the far corner. Clara was still there, but her eyes no longer sought his. She only carried her tray, moving quietly into the shadows. The distance between them was no measure of feet or land. It was built of power and judgment wider than any prairie. In the brilliance of the banquet, Thomas saw only a quiet sorrow. And within that sorrow, a touch of pity, pity for Clara, and pity for himself, for he now understood, no matter the laughter, no matter the wine, no matter how many young ladies waited, he would always be alone so long as his heart remained bound. When the guests had begun to leave, when the music faded soft, Thomas slipped out onto the porch. The night air cut sharp against his skin, snow drifting like whispers in the dark. He lifted his face to the black Wyoming sky, listening to the distant hooves fading across the plain. Behind him, the lights of the banquet glowed still, but they felt like nothing more than a curtain of lies. He whispered just enough for the wind to hear Clara. Her name floated into the night like a prayer, and he knew then, no matter how carefully he tried to hide it, his gaze, his heart, would always belong to her. Part 5. A confession in the dark night, draped over the double B like a heavy black blanket. The winter wind whistled through the cracks, carrying with it the bite of snow. From the great hall came the muffled strains of music, the rise of laughter, and the glow of oil lamps still burning bright. But out by the stables, only a single lantern swung in the wind, its dim flame casting long, restless shadows across the weathered beams. Thomas stepped slowly inside his boots, pressing softly against the straw. The smell of hay, the warm breath of horses, the sharp tang of oil smoke, familiar scents that eased his heart. Here he was not the heir, not the son being forced to choose among 5 heiresses. Here he was, only Thomas, a man whose heart longed for one soul alone. At the far end, Clara stood brushing Copper, the horse Thomas trusted above all others. Her brown hair slipped loose from its simple braid, catching the faint glow of the lantern. Hearing his steps, she turned her voice low, tired from the long day. The master of the banquet is still inside. You should be there. Thomas halted, his eyes fixed on her, his voice deep and rough. I couldn't stay, Clara. I had to come here. She said nothing. The horse snorted, filling the silence between them. And in that silence, Thomas could hear the pounding of his own heart, loud as a war drum. He stepped closer, eyes burning through the dark. They want me to choose, to marry for land, for money, for power, but none of it matters. Without you, Clara, the double B is nothing but a prison. Clara's hand trembled, the brush slipping from her fingers into the straw. She bent quickly to retrieve it, avoiding his gaze. But his voice came again, firm, breaking at the edges. I'd give it all up. The land, the cattle, even the Brennan name. I only need you. Clara lifted her face, her brown eyes shimmering, yet steady with resolve. She shook her head gently. Don't say that, Thomas. You'll regret it. Maybe not today, maybe not next year, but one day you'll look back and see you threw away everything for an orphan girl. No. Thomas closed the space, until only a breath remained between them. The only regret I'd ever carry would be losing you. Clara clasped her hands, tight her fingers, pale. Her breath came uneven, mingling with the restless snorts of the horses. Outside, the wind howled, but in that moment, the silence between them roared louder than any storm. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Your world and mine, they'll never meet. I'm just the girl who cleans the stalls. I won't be your burden." Thomas reached out his hand, brushing her wrist a touch as tender as warmth in the freezing dark. "You're not a burden. You're the only reason I can breathe in this house." Clara bit her lip, tears glinting at the corners of her eyes. Yet she stepped back, her voice trembling. "Don't make this harder. I've seen too many stories end in ruin, the rich boy, the poor girl. And in the end, only heartbreak. We're not like them," Thomas said, each word hard as steel. "I swear it, Clara. I'll be different. I won't leave you. Not ever." The silence stretched their hearts beating in the dark like one. Then Clara's tears fell, and she turned, shaking her head. But Thomas moved quickly, catching her hand, holding it firm. "Look at me, Clara." She hesitated, then slowly lifted her face. Her brown eyes, wet with pain, met the steady blue of his. His voice came low, hoarse, trembling with truth. "I love you, and I would give it all away if only I still had you." Clara trembled, her lips parting as if to speak, when the barn door burst open. Light from the hallway spilled in, and with it came the tall figure of Marcus. Two wealthy fathers stood behind him, their curious eyes cutting through the dark. The moment shattered. Clara jerked her hand free, bowing her head, her cheeks burning with shame. Marcus loomed, his voice cold as a blade. "A Brennan does not whisper in the shadows with a servant. You disgrace yourself and this name." Thomas clenched his teeth, ready to defy him, but Clara turned quickly away, slipping out another door. The wind rushed in, carrying the scent of snow. Thomas stood still, his hand empty, his chest hollow, as though crushed by an unseen fist. Marcus strode forward, laying a heavy hand on his son's shoulder. "Enough. You have 1 week to choose, and I'll not see you near that girl again." The lantern swayed wildly in the draft, throwing Thomas's shadow long and wavering across the barn floor, fragile as his heart. Outside, snow drifted steady across the prairie, a white silence spreading wide. But within him, another storm had begun. One of love, of yearning for freedom, of a pain too deep for words. Part 6. Caught in the Shadows. The barn door burst open with a crash, shattering a moment fragile as a thread. Light from the hallway ripped into the lantern's warm glow, tearing the darkness wide. In the doorway stood Marcus Brennan, tall and cold, as immovable as a snow-capped mountain. Behind him loomed the silhouettes of wealthy fathers, fresh from the banquet, curiosity glinting in their eyes. Clara startled the tray in her hands, trembling crystal glasses clinking together. Her face flushed hot, her gaze darting downward as though searching for a place to hide. But there was nowhere in the double B large enough to shield an orphan girl from Marcus Brennan's wrath. Marcus strode inside, each heavy step against the wooden floor, sounding like judgment itself. The smell of cigar smoke clung to him, mixing with hay and horse sweat until the air turned suffocating. His cold gray eyes landed on his son, first sparking with anger. "A Brennan," his voice thundered, "does not whisper to a servant in a stable." The words struck like a lash. Heat surged into Thomas's face. He stood tall, meeting his father's stare, fists clenched tight at his sides. Behind him, Clara lowered her head, further brown hair falling to shield a trembling face. Marcus turned his gaze stabbing into Clara. His voice cut sharp as ice. "And you're nothing but an orphan clinging to Brennan charity. Do not mistake knowing how to bridle a horse for belonging among great names." Clara's shoulders trembled. Her lips pressed tight to hold back a sob. She edged back until her spine touched the cold wooden door. In that moment, she looked no more than a frightened bird cornered by a hawk. Enough, Thomas's voice rumbled low raw as wind against canyon walls. He stepped forward, placing himself squarely before Clara, blue eyes burning. "You will not speak of her that way." Marcus's mouth curled into a half smile, yet it held nothing but scorn. "What then? Thomas, will you throw away the double B for a pair of teary brown eyes and a patched dress?" Thomas's chest clenched. Each word salted the wound in his heart, but behind him, Clara's hand brushed his arm, her voice unsteady. "Please, don't. I'll be fine." He turned, meeting her gaze in the lantern-light eyes, shimmering with gratitude and with pain. His heart broke at the sight. He longed to pull her close to shield her from all of it. Yet his hands closed only around empty air. Marcus raised his hand, pointing directly at Clara. "Out. And from this night forward, stay away from my son." Clara hesitated, twisting the fabric of her dress in white-knuckled fists. She bowed her head low, whispering so softly it barely reached the air. "Yes, sir." She turned. The wooden door creaked open, and the winter wind rushed in, carrying the sharp scent of snow. Her figure slipped into the night, leaving Thomas's chest torn in two. His hand reached instinctively after her, but found only the frozen emptiness. Marcus's voice lowered, yet each word fell like stone. "You have 1 week. 1 week to choose, and I will not see you near her again. Do you understand?" Thomas's jaw tightened, blood rising in his clenched fists. He gave no reply. His silence Marcus mistook for consent. With a final nod, the patriarch turned away. The other fathers followed quietly, their boots fading into the night until only Thomas remained. The barn sank into stillness. The lantern swayed, stretching his shadow long and wavering across the planks. Horses breathed soft. The prairie wind howled faintly outside like whispers of comfort against his pain. Thomas bowed his head, burying his face in his hands. His breath came rough and heavy. Tears did not fall, yet the fire in his chest burned fierce as any flame. His whisper broke the silence ragged as a prayer. "Clara, I'm sorry." The wind carried the words away, scattering them into the night, along with an unspoken vow. The double B still blazed with light behind him, but Thomas's heart was darker than ever before. Part 7. Days of Doubt. In the days that followed the banquet, the double B knew no peace. The laughter of young heiresses drifted along the wooden porch, their bright gowns flashing like banners across the prairie. Each morning, carriages rolled out to the fields with picnic baskets, blankets, and polite invitations. And each morning, Thomas, by his father's command, went with them. His body was present, but his heart wandered elsewhere. On the first day, Eleanor Harrison invited him to ride across the plains. Thin sunlight pierced the gray clouds, striking her dark blue dress until it shone like a proud bird in flight. She laughed beneath the brim of her wide hat. "Can you see it? Thomas, one day, the railroad will carve across this grassland. Trains will bring merchants gold and prosperity. Thomas nodded, forcing a smile. Perhaps. But in his mind, the clatter of wheels could not drown the memory of Clara's quiet laugh in the stables, coaxing Copper into calm. Against all the grandeur of iron and steel, he recalled only her callous, tender hands. The next afternoon, Abigail Prescott spread a blanket beneath a cottonwood and drew a leather-bound book from her bag. The winter sun dappled through the branches, leaving shifting light upon the page. "Let me read you a verse," she said, her eyes bright with intelligence. Thomas listened as her voice carried the polished rhythm of poetry. Yet when she reached the line, "Love is the breath of the soul," his chest ached. He remembered the trembling breath of Clara in the barn the night he swore to give up everything for her. One breath, fleeting, but real. So real, it made every polished verse feel distant. "What do you think?" Abigail asked, hopeful. Thomas managed a thin smile. "It's beautiful." But inside, he felt as empty as an unwritten page. On the third day, Mary Whitman led him to the riverbank, where her family had begun to carve a channel into the frozen earth. Water trickled clear, glinting in the pale sun. "Do you see, Thomas, water is power? It turns barren soil into harvest. If the Double B and Whitmans join hands, all Wyoming will flourish." Thomas bent low, scooping water into his palm. The icy stream slipped through his fingers, cold as chances he did not wish to take. For an instant, he imagined that hand not catching water, but clasping Clara's small, fragile, yet warm enough to set his chest alight. He closed his eyes, letting the water fall. Mary smiled, thinking he agreed, but in truth, he was lost in his own emptiness. On the fourth day, Sarah Carmichael strolled with him through the flower garden, hastily arranged before the great porch. Her words cut sharp as knives. "Politics is a double-edged blade, Mr. Brennan. Held properly, it can carve out an empire. Tell me, do you have the strength to wield it?" Thomas's blue eyes reflected the fire in hers. His voice was slow, deliberate. "I'm not sure. I want to hold that blade." Sarah laughed, but her smile carried the chill of steel. "Then someone else will wield it for you." Her words echoed in his head, yet louder still he heard Clara's whisper, "We belong to two different worlds." On the fifth day, Lydia Sterling pulled him into a dance on the open meadow. Her golden hair spun bright under the pale sun, her laughter ringing free. "Wyoming is far too dull," she cried. "But if I were Mrs. Brennan, I'd turn this land into a ball every season." Thomas smiled faintly, stepping with her through the frosty grass. But in his heart, the only ball he remembered was that fleeting glance from Clara across the banquet hall, an instant that silenced all music. Day by day, Thomas fulfilled his duty, writing listening to poetry, speaking of water, hearing lessons of politics, smiling through dances. But each night, when he lay beneath the dark wooden beams of his room, his eyes would not close. Clara's face rose in his mind the way her eyes fell in shame. Her hands trembled when scorn the firm tone in her voice, when she said, "You must choose, because the Double B needs you." Inside him, two worlds pulled tight, one of duty, one of love, one crowded with laughter, one quiet with the scent of hay. And in those days, Thomas came to know true loneliness, not the loneliness of being alone, but of living surrounded by people who could never understand the desire of his heart. On the seventh night, he sat alone on the porch. Snow drifted across the wide plains, painting them white. The weak flame of an oil lamp cast his breath into clouds. From far off came the whinny of horses, and his chest ached. He whispered into the cold, his voice breaking like confession. "Clara, I don't know what to do anymore." The wind chimes at the door gave a faint reply, soft as comfort. But the night stretched on, and the weight of an empire pressed harder against a heart longing for freedom. His days became a chain of doubt with no path to release. Part 8. The Fateful Christmas Eve. That Christmas, the Double B shone brighter than it ever had. The great hall was dressed in deep green pine wreaths of red berries hung on every doorframe. Oil lamps burned high, casting hundreds of golden flames across polished beams. A red carpet stretched from the doorway to the main banquet table, lending the prairie a touch of grandeur it rarely knew. Outside, snow fell without pause. White flakes kissed the roof, scattered across the steps, shattered softly against the frozen glass. Inside, warmth and fragrance mingled, the spice of roast goose, the comfort of fresh bread, the resin of pine, while violins lilted above the hum of laughter, sweeping the guests into a night of splendor. Marcus Brennan stood at the center, his black coat broad over his chest, authority written in every movement. He strode the table, raising his glass in toasts, his smile hard but precise. Each step, a reminder of the empire he had built with blood and steel, each word a claim to the power of the Double B. Thomas sat beside him, shoulders bound tight in his black coat. To the eye, he was every bit the heir, but within only emptiness. Laughter and conversation passed him like distant echoes. Around him, the heiresses glittered. Eleanor Harrison's golden hair glowed beneath the lamps. Abigail Prescott fingered a small book, offering knowing smiles. Mary Whitman leaned close, her voice steady as a flowing stream. Sarah Carmichael watched keenly, her sharp gaze weighing every gesture. Lydia Sterling laughed bright, her white dress gleaming like fresh snow. They were radiant 5 stars burning in a winter sky. But Thomas's eyes sought something else, a quiet figure moving at the edge of the room. Clara. Her old gray dress had been mended once more. She carried a tray of wine, her brown hair pinned up a few strands, falling to touch her flushed cheeks. She moved silently among the crowd, unseen, a shadow slipping between light. Yet to Thomas, every step of hers outweighed the music louder than the violins themselves. He longed to rise, to cross the room, to tear away the distance. But his father stood close, Marcus's steel-gray eyes burning like iron in the forge. Then Marcus lifted his hand. The music ceased. His voice rang across the hall. Friends, family, honored guests. Tonight is more than Christmas. Tonight marks a new beginning for the Double B. And this evening, my son Thomas Brennan will announce his bride. The hall fell silent. Whispers stirred. Eyes turned toward Thomas. The young ladies straightened in their seats, cheeks, flushed eyes expectant. Their fathers nodded subtly, waiting for a contract to be sealed in words. Marcus's hand fell heavy on his son's shoulder, his gaze sharp as shackles. Now, Thomas, the time has come. Thomas's heart pounded each beat, louder than the wind clawing at the windows, louder than the snow tapping against the glass. Before him lay 5 clear paths, wealth, power, security, yet not one of them led where his heart wished to go. His eyes lifted, seeking instinct, and there Clara. She bent low, offering a tray to a guest. Her eyes avoided his, but for one fleeting instant they met. Brown eyes trembling, filled with a storm of feeling. That glance lit the fire in his chest into a blaze. Marcus leaned close, voice low but iron strong. "Stand. Choose. Do not shame me." Thomas drew in a breath. His legs felt heavy as stone, but he rose. All eyes turned. Silk-rustled breaths held. He looked at each face. Eleanor Abigail. Mary Sarah Lydia. Each one a doorway into power. Yet with every glance, his heart whispered back, "Not her, not her, not her." His father's hand clamped tighter. Marcus's nod urged him, pressed him like a vice. Thomas swallowed his throat dry, his voice raw. Yet through the thunder of his heart, his words rang out before he could even think. "I cannot choose any of them." The sound cracked the silence like a storm. Gasps spread across the room. Marcus froze, rage flaring across his face. The young ladies stared wide-eyed, some hiding their mouths, some flushing red. Fathers stiffened. Whispers swelled. Thomas drew a deeper breath, his voice steadier. "I cannot choose for land or for money or for power. My heart belongs to another." The hall seemed to hold its breath. Then every gaze followed his eyes to the back of the room where Clara stood frozen. The tray in her hands shook, a glass fell shattering sharp against the floor. The sound rang clear like fate itself striking its chord. Clara's eyes widened, tears glistening. She wanted to flee, but her legs betrayed her. Marcus roared, his voice like thunder. "Enough!" He turned on his son, fury burning in his eyes. "You would bury this empire for an orphan girl." Thomas lifted his head, his blue eyes blazing in the firelight. His voice carried strong as steel. "If she is not beside me, then the double B means nothing." The hall shook with whispers, gasps, and pounding hearts. But within the storm, Thomas felt a clarity brighter than ever before. For he knew this night, this single fateful Christmas, would decide the course of his life forever. Part 9. The Declaration of Love. In the great hall of the Double B, even the fire seemed to still its crackling, as though the flames themselves yielded to the heavy silence. Every eye fixed on Thomas Brennan, the son who now stood tall beneath the glow of golden lamps, daring to speak words no one expected. From the corner, a glass slipped from Clara's trembling hands, shattering against the wooden floor. The sound rang through the hall, like a bell announcing the storm. She stood frozen tray, quivering, wide brown eyes glistening with tears. Marcus Brennan, his face burning red with fury, raised a hand and pointed at his son. "What did you say? Do you mean to disgrace this family before them all?" Thomas drew a deep breath. His heart thundered, but his voice rang clear, every word sharp as steel. "I cannot choose any among them, because my heart has already chosen. And that choice is Clara Morrison." The hall erupted gasps, whispers, chairs scraping across the floor. The young ladies sat pale or flushed, stunned into silence. The powerful fathers exchanged sharp looks, their discomfort plain. Some of the older guests gaped as though they had heard madness spoken aloud. Clara stepped back, her small hands setting the tray aside with trembling care. She wished to deny it, to disappear. But Thomas's eyes held her blue and bright in the candlelight, drawing her out of the shadows. Marcus roared, his voice rolling like thunder. "Enough, Thomas. You would cast away thousands of acres, herds of cattle, the honor of this family, for an orphan girl with no name." Thomas stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the polished floor. His words struck like hammer blows. Yes, because without her, all of it means nothing. A ripple swept the hall whispers, breaking into voices. He's lost his mind. Marcus's son, throwing away the double B for a servant girl, impossible. Then a rough, weathered voice spoke from near the fire. Old Jake, the foreman, who had served the double B since its first stones were set, placed his glass on the table. His tired eyes looked at Marcus, but his words carried to every corner. Marcus, have you forgotten? The double B wasn't built on land and cattle alone. It was built on sweat and loyalty. And that girl, Clara, she works harder than any I've seen. If Thomas loves her, that's no weakness. That's strength. The hall hushed. A few nods appeared, a few low voices of agreement. A small current began to shift the tide. Marcus's teeth clenched, fury blazing in his gray eyes. He spun toward Clara, his words dripping with contempt. You, what have you done to my son? Snared him with your pitiful tears. Clara flinched, stepping back, lips trembling. But before she could answer, Thomas moved, placing himself before her. His hand reached for hers, gripping tight. Warmth from his touch surged into her, and tears spilled down her cheeks. She has done nothing. Thomas declared, his voice echoing through the hall. The fault is mine, because I love her, and I will love her until the day I draw my last breath. Clara's heart broke open at his words. Her brown eyes, wet with fear and wonder, met his. She could no longer hide, no longer turn away. His love, spoken before the world, was unshakable, and her heart too was bound. Marcus trembled with rage, veins rising in his clenched fists. His voice dropped cold as ice. From this moment you are no son of mine. The double B has no place for a traitor. The words cut like a blade, severing blood and name. Yet Thomas stood tall, his grip on Clara's hand tightening. He raised his head, meeting his father's fire with unyielding strength. Then I choose freedom. I choose love. And I choose Clara. The silence weighed heavy. Then from the back, soft applause broke. A lone cowboy, one of the hired hands, rose to his feet. Then another. And another. Men who had seen Clara labor day and night in the stables now stood for her. Their clapping rolled louder, each strike a blow against Marcus, each sound a balm for Thomas and Clara. Clara turned to him, tears streaming, whispering through her sobs. You're mad, Thomas. You've lost everything. Thomas smiled gently, blue eyes shining with calm. No, I've found everything. And in that moment, walls crumbled between rich and poor, between power and humility. The hall grew still. Outside, snow whispered against the glass. Within their hands remained clasped a vow unbroken. That Christmas Eve the double B glowed with candlelight. But the true flame burned in the hearts of two souls daring to stand against the world. A forbidden love, a reckless choice, yet the bravest moment of their lives. Part 10. Steps into Freedom. Christmas night blanketed the prairie in white. Snow drifted thick from the sky, covering rooftops, fences, and every trace of footsteps. From the great hall of the Double B, golden light spilled through tall windows. Music, laughter, and voices raised in anger still echoed faintly. But at the wooden threshold, standing against the cold wind, Thomas Brennan and Clara Morrison faced a different world. His hand clasped hers, warmth flowing between them until she trembled. In that moment, Clara saw it. Clearly, he had given up an empire, a name, a fortune. For these small hands, she could barely believe were worth holding. Tears still clung to her lashes, but now a fragile smile broke through. You she whispered, her voice trembling. You truly left it all behind. Thomas bent low, blue eyes steady beneath the falling snow. He shook his head gently. No, I didn't leave anything. I just found a life worth living. They stepped down from the porch. Snow crunched beneath their boots. The prairie stretched wide before them, cold, endless, but free. The wind cut sharp across their faces, their breath rising white into the air, mingling as if in an unseen vow. From afar, church bells rang their deep tones rolling through the winter night. Clara lifted her eyes toward the sound, tears shimmering as she breathed. It sounds like a beginning. Thomas smiled, tightening his grip on her hand. Yes, the bells are calling us toward freedom. They passed the stables. Copper snorted softly, eyes glinting in the lantern light. Thomas paused, running a hand down the horse's mane. Tomorrow we'll ride together. To anywhere, so long as you're with me. Clara laid her palm against the worn saddle leather, rough and loving. She nodded, needing no more words. Behind them, Marcus's angry voice still roared inside the hall, leaking through the windows. But the storm outside swallowed it whole. On the snow-lit steps, all that remained was the sound of two hearts beating with the rhythm of distant bells. Clara leaned her cheek against Thomas's shoulder, her voice breaking yet warm. I always thought I'd be nothing more than a stable girl. I never dared to dream. Thomas drew her close, whispering in her ear, steady and tender. You are the most beautiful thing I've ever known. And tonight, we don't have to dream anymore. They walked on, leaving behind the golden glow, the music, and the faces of power. Before them stretched only white snow and an unknown road. But with every step away from the double B, the world grew lighter, freer. Above, snowflakes glittered in moonlight like stars fallen to earth. Clara smiled through her tears, letting the flakes rest on her hair. Thomas brushed them gently away, the simple gesture as binding as any vow. At the edge of the ranch, they stopped. Thomas looked back one last time, the great house blazing with light, the empire his father had built. To him, it now seemed distant, a world no longer his. He breathed deep, then turned without regret. Come on, Clara. She nodded, her brown eyes shining in the dark, her hand clasped tightly in his. Together, they stepped into the snow, leaving twin tracks behind two paths, merging as one. The church bells rang again, louder now, as if blessing their way. In the cold wind, they heard the steady sound of their own hearts, warm, unbroken. That Christmas Eve of 1887 on the harsh Wyoming frontier, a young man and a young woman chose each other above wealth, above power, above every name and legacy, and so began their steps into freedom. The snow-covered road stretched ahead, glowing under the moon. Two shadows walked side by side, their footprints soon softened by drifting wind. Far off, the bells tolled again, steady and deep, falling like a benediction across the silent prairie. Clara drew her thin shawl tighter, her hands trembling, yet still clasping his. Thomas leaned close, his voice low and warm as the night wind. No, I haven't lost a thing, for at last I've found a life worth living. Clara lifted her eyes to him, brown eyes shimmering no longer with fear or shame, but with trust and peace. In the unforgiving West, against storms and prejudice, they had chosen love and freedom. And that was the greatest treasure of all. The wind carried the scent of pine, their breath mingling white in the night. Hooves echoed faintly in the distance, steady as a heartbeat guiding them into a new beginning. In the harsh West, love and freedom are the greatest riches.